This is going to be a pretty quick whistle-stop tour of the Act. And I want to start by looking at the legal framework in the UK now, because we have in the Data Protection Act, it brings in some of its supplements and adds to the GDPR. It also transposes into law the Law Enforcement Directive, but it actually extends some of that to domestic policing, etc. And it also brings in some provisions relating to the intelligence services. But I understand that most of you are here from businesses and you don't need to sort of worry about those aspects. So I'm going to concentrate very much on the sort of the main parts of the Data Protection Act and how they'll affect most organisations. So as we have a direct effect piece of regulation coming in from Europe, is at the same time we're preparing to leave Europe. So it is a challenge, and there was a lot of discussion about what we, how we would sort of legislate in this area. And the government could have done this through a series of secondary legislation, statutory instruments. At the ICO, we pressed very hard for primary legislation, to have an act, to have a bill going through Parliament so it's properly debated. But we're really pleased that it happened, but it was a lengthy task, and it's a complex document as a result. And perhaps we hadn't realised quite how complex this task would be when we started out on that route. So some of this, what the DPA provides, it is a comprehensive data protection piece of legislation that covers an enormous amount of processing in the UK, going further and beyond what the GDPR covers. And it's a little bit, there's lots of familiar concepts, and some of the, the special category data seems very similar to sensitive personal data, SIs, actually instruments that appeared elsewhere. And if you look through it, there's a lot of things that seem sort of actually very familiar to people in the UK. And that was very much a government approach and a deliberate policy that they wanted, many aspects of the Data Protection Act 1998, which people were used to actually be incorporated in the Act. But it would be sort of misleading to think that it is the same. It's structured differently. And it has to be read alongside the GDPR for the vast majority of organisations. And during the Parliament, it was called by one Lord, Hamlet without the Prince. And I think if you do look at this great big lengthy document, you cannot find the GDPR. And I think it sums it up very well, that image, but apologies for English idioms. But I think that it does explain very much. People expect to see something that covers everything in the same way as the old Data Protection Act didn't. But for the vast majority of processing in this country, you'll have to read them side by side. So it fills the gaps. It's where the member states are allowed to have some flexibilities or derogations. I think people said it was over 50. The UK has chosen to sort of complete some of these gaps and choose to take these freedoms, if you like. And I think for us, it is the sort of final piece of the legislation. So it fills gaps, but it does extend in some places. Very briefly, it's covered, there's 7 parts. It's divided into 7 parts, but people have called it a beast of a bill. And I think John has explained, some of the, the sheer volume of this bill. An act, I should say. I've been so used to calling it a bill that I keep calling it the Act. So it's divided into 7 parts. It's got 215 sections, and it has 20 schedules, some of which are very lengthy. But in fact, many people say, for most organisations, you probably need to perhaps look at part 1 for the introduction, part 2, perhaps even then only 2 chapters, and perhaps if you're interested in the Information Commissioner's powers and enforcement, yes, you could look at those. And there's about 4 schedules out of those 20 that probably really do have a major, sort of they are worth really considering in detail. So an awful lot of this Act is aimed at intelligence services processing, law enforcement, and some of it, quite technical really for us as a regulator, our powers and functions at the ICO.